All right, welcome APUSH students. This is your chapter 13 notes. Expansion War and Sectional Crisis, 1844 to 1860. This is the prelude to the Civil War. This is our last chapter, our last bit of information before we get to probably the most divisive and terrible thing our country's gone through. All right. Important terms here right off the bat. Manifest destiny is a term that you have to know, and it's pretty easy to understand. Essentially, it's the idea that we've been given this right by God to go from sea to shining sea, that we should spread across the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. It was coined by John O'Sullivan, and it spreads through the newspapers, and it kind of captures the American spirit. And we've gone to the Mississippi. We've gotten that from Britain through war. We've gained the Louisiana Purchase by buying it from Napoleon. Now there's a section of what will become our country still left to get. One of those sections is Oregon. And of course, the other sections are currently owned by Mexico in this time period. Oregon at the time was also occupied by Britain. There was like a dual ownership there. But we are ready to take Oregon. It has some good fertile valleys there, good for farming. And 54-40 becomes the rallying cry. We want this. That's where we want the new border of the United States to be. But we're not going to get 54-40, and we're not going to fight. We get a compromise, and us and Britain settle on the 49th parallel. And so that's where the northern border of the United States is today. All right, California is also a very important purchase that we'd like to get our hands on, piece of land out there. In this time period, however, it is part of Mexico. It's mostly filled with Catholic missions and mostly Native Americans, with some Mexicans scattered throughout. Indians scattered throughout the Great Plains, somewhat sedentary, meaning somewhat settled. But they do hunt bison. It is the most important aspect of their lives for the most part. And European weapons are going to transform life on the plains. Guns are going to change everything out there. The election of 1844, we get James K. Polk. He's a man who fully supports the annexation of Texas. When we last saw Texas, they were fighting for themselves to get their independence from Mexico, and they're a country unto themselves, but they realized that they'd be far stronger as being a part of the United States, and they want in. All they needed was a president who wanted them in, and they get it here in James K. Polk. So Texas is annexed via a joint resolution in 1845, and they're admitted into the country by December. They're going to come in as a slave state. Now, Henry Clay, the great compromiser, and some Whigs resisted the expansion. They're worried about tensions over slavery. We have another slave state coming in, and possible new slave states by any new lands gained. And so that's a bit of a problem. We're going to do it anyway, of course, which leads us into the Mexican-American War. Now, the Slidell mission is where James K. Polk sends John Slidell to buy California and New Mexico for $30 million. Mexico makes the mistake of refusing to meet with him. They're not going to sell this land, which is very far away from Mexico City, and it's sparsely populated with Mexicans anyway. They just don't want to sell it. They realize America is a dangerous country on their border, and they're not going to sell this important land to make America even more powerful. There's a boundary issue. Texas claims the Rio Grande, but Mexico claims it controls all the way up to the Nueces River. So we have some issues with Mexico. It's not going to work out for Mexico as they try to resist us. You have the conscious Whigs here. These are Whigs, or people that oppose the war on moral grounds, being for the most part that these lands don't belong to us, and we shouldn't just be using war to take them. They're against the expansion of slavery, of course. Ralph Waldo Emerson, the transcendentalist, says Mexico will poison us, and he's right. It does. it's going to be a big factor in leading us to the Civil War. We get the Wilmot Proviso. That's one that you always have to know. David Wilmot's a Democrat from New York who introduces an amendment to a bill which states slavery will not exist in any land gained from Mexico. That's his idea. He's like, listen, we need this land for the country. That's great. We'll gain the land, but we'll just make it where slavery cannot be introduced into these lands, which passes in the House of Representatives because they have more representatives there because the North is more populous than the South. But it doesn't pass the Senate where the votes are essentially even. We see the rise of the Free Soil Party here in this time period. And Free Soilers, as they were known, were against the extension of slavery into the territories. Their argument is they try a different tact here. Their argument is that it would take away jobs from whites. You have this new territory that you could be having jobs that would go to white people, but instead, if you let slavery in there, of course, you can't, compete against slavery. Free labor, free soil, free men. That becomes the rallying cry of the Free Soil Party. I mean, this is such a big issue here. All right, the election of 1848, we get General Zachary Taylor, who was a war hero from the Mexican-American War. He wins. He's a Whig. You also, in 1848, get the beginnings of the gold rush. John Sutter is going to he's going to find gold out there in California, and he's going to set up some mills. Word's going to spread, and the world goes crazy. 49ers were what we named the people, because most of the people come on the rush in 1849, so they become known as the 49ers. You get people coming from China, Europe, other parts of America. People are, leaving their families to go get rich in the gold rush. It's pretty insane. You see the swelling of California cities, the creation of California cities. San Francisco explodes overnight, basically. And many of those will go to ghost towns after the gold dries up, of course. Most of the people going are men. The population increases in California from 14,000 to 220,000 in only 4 years. And many Mexicans and Californios were forced off of their lands because of the massive amount of white people flocking to California to get rich on gold. A lot going on right here. Also in 1850, we get the Compromise of 1850. Now, they tried to pass this through Congress, and it failed. So Northerners had a good idea. They broke it into 5 parts, and they passed these things individually. What they got out of the Compromise of 1850 was popular sovereignty in the Mexican cession, lands gained by Mexico from beating Mexico, which was the New Mexico Territory, California. We're going to allow the people to choose. California would be admitted as a free state, however, which would give free states an advantage in the Senate. What do Southerners get? Well, they get a more strict fugitive slave law, which was the most divisive part of the Compromise of 1850. And this would allow them to go, basically grab African Americans off the street without a trial and take them back to the South. Abolitionists, as you can imagine, were furious with this. But slave trade is also outlawed in Washington, D.C., which is a southern state or a southern area, but it is our nation's capital. And so as part of the compromise, they're going to make it where you cannot have slavery in our nation's capital. And Texas would be paid money to relinquish some land in its dispute with Mexico. And that's Compromise of 1850. And it's something that you're going to have to know. We've had the Compromise of 1820, the Missouri Compromise of 1820. It doesn't work. It doesn't. It's a Band-Aid. And the Compromise of 1850 will be a Band-Aid too. We get the end of second party system. You're going to get several parties and stuff going on here. We see the impact of the Fugitive Slave Law or Slave Act. You get northern states passing personal liberty laws, which barred involvement in returning runaway slaves. They are not going to help the South get their slaves back, and the South is going to be angry about it. The Wisconsin State Supreme Court declared the Fugitive Slave Act unconstitutional, which increased tensions. You have a federal versus state throwdown here, which you will see many times throughout American history. You also see the end of the Whigs in this time period with the death of Henry Clay and Daniel Webster. in 1852. So the Whigs as a political party will disappear. We get Franklin Pierce's presidency. He gets elected in 1852. He makes the Austin Manifesto, which was a plan, or he's a part of it, should I say, a plan to buy Cuba from Spain, and if they refuse, the United States would take it by force. This just infuriates Northerners who are looking at America as a country hell bent on gaining new lands for slavery. They think that Cuba would certainly come in as a slave state. It's one thing to beat Mexico, but to go to war with a European power, even if it is a weakened one, for slavery just doesn't make sense to many people in America. The Gadsden Purchase, that's when U.S. Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, who will later on be the president of the Confederate States of America, buys land from Mexico for a transcontinental railroad. $15 million, I think, or $30 million, somewhere around there. It's just a narrow strip of land that Mexico owns, but we need it. Geographically speaking, we want a transcontinental railroad to go through there, and so we're going to buy it from Mexico. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, another big ticket item. It was a response to the Gadsden Purchase because the North wanted their own transcontinental railroad and proposed popular sovereignty in Nebraska territory. The people would choose popular sovereignty. The people would choose. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act, cause and effect, you should know that it overturns the Missouri Compromise, which said that land north of it would automatically come in as a free state. So here is an overturning. Presumably, Kansas would be a slave state and Nebraska would be free. Kansas used to be part of the Nebraska territory, but they split the two, and they think that they're going to have a balance here, that one would come in as free and one would come in as a slave state. Doesn't happen that way, of course, because of bleeding Kansas. All right. We get a little bit of Abraham Lincoln in this time period. He finally makes his arrival. In his early life, he married Mary Todd, who was from Lexington, Kentucky. Knew Henry Clay, okay. Shared beliefs with the American Colonization Society. What that means is that Lincoln early on was an advocate of sending African Americans back to Africa. He didn't really feel like they could exist in the American system and thought that they would be better being shipped overseas. Famously, Lincoln went up against Stephen Douglas, the Little Giant, as he was known, in a series of debates for the Senate seat in Illinois. But Douglas would end up defeating Lincoln. Douglas being a Democrat, he would defeat Lincoln in these, but he would end up alienating the South in the process. But Lincoln would come back and emerge to a national level. The Freeport Doctrine, if a territory wanted to, it could keep slavery out, which split the Democratic Party. So you got some issues there. That's going to certainly hurt the Democrats' chances of winning the next presidential election. You also had John Brown. Remember last time we saw John Brown as far as like videos in class, he was part of the Potawatomi massacre. Him and his sons had gone in and killed pro-slavery people in Kansas. And John Brown's trying to incite a slave rebellion. He wants to put guns in the hands of slaves and let them, win their freedom over their masters. Many Southerners felt that the Northern Republican Party was filled with John Browns. Excuse me. They believe there's a conspiracy here that, this is something that the Northerners are planning as a whole. Is this really, really, really going to put us on the fast track to the Civil War? And then we get, of course, the election of 1860. What's bad about this is that Lincoln doesn't even appear on Southern ballots. They refuse to even allow him to be a choice in the South. Yet Lincoln will win. And for Southerners, this shows them that their voice doesn't matter. And Lincoln he's been running on a campaign of not to eliminate slavery where it exists, but to disallow slavery from emerging in any new territories gained by the United States. However, Southerners see that this would ultimately lead in the dissolution of slavery because they would be outnumbered in the Senate and they would be able to essentially, pass laws to get rid of slavery. So the South is furious that Lincoln has been elected, even though he wasn't on their ballot. And, as we will see in the next chapter, South Carolina is going to lead the way. They're going to secede from the United States, and we are going to get the bloodiest conflict in our history. All right, quick review. Just remember, manifest destiny, very simple. From sea to shining sea, it's our God-given right to own these lands for our country. The Mexican-American War is a divisive war in America where it's going to be mostly Southerners partaking. Northerners kind of stand back from it because they feel it's a bad war meant just to expand slavery. Free soilers emerge, free soil, free men, with the idea, of course, that new lands would be free. Compromise of 1850s trying to calm down tensions. We're going to get California as a free state. We're going to have popular sovereignty in the other areas. You're going to get a very tough fugitive slave act for the South. You're going to get the banning of slavery in Washington, D.C. And, Texas pays a little bit of money. All right, guys, that is it. This really, the big ticket items, Manifest Destiny, that's a name drop. Free soilers are name drops. Compromise of 1850 is a name drop. Kansas-Nebraska Act, which led to this civil war in Kansas, bleeding Kansas, is the name drop. Dred Scott, remember that decision in Dred Scott, although I did not see him on the PowerPoint here. Remember that Dred Scott was a slave taken to northern lands by his master, and so he tries to sue for his freedom. He gets denied, and Roger B. Taney, the Supreme Court Justice head, says that African Americans do not have rights to even appear in court. So that's a bad one. All right, election of 1860, Lincoln wins, and that is the final straw. All right, thanks for listening. Make sure you take good notes.